Hey all you cool cats and kittens out there, this is Drunk Shuckle with another base Neo deck. I've already done Mulligan Mewtwo for the base set era, so if you're not familiar with it, go look at that. Or you can just look at this card for 5 seconds and see that this barrier attack is pretty good. 2 Psychic Energy, you discard one of them and your opponent can't do anything to you on their next turn. And your opponent can still hit you with stuff like energy removal, but in the base Neo format, you get all kinds of new tools to help you with that, like No Removal Gem, Eco Gem, Chaos Gem. You even have stuff like Focus Band that can help keep Mewtwo alive in case it ever does get attacked during one of those turns where you have to reattach some energy. So for the base Neo build of Mewtwo with all of these new tools, we will be using absolutely none of them, because why would you? Mulligan Mewtwo Part 2. Yeah, you're going to be running 2 copies of base set Mewtwo in this one. You can only run one, it's just there is a chance of Mewtwo getting knocked out in base Neo because there are Pokemon like Misty Staryu or Neo Genesis Electabuzz that can hit through barrier with Swift. But the main point of the deck is to have to redraw your opening hand over and over, letting your opponent take a bunch of mulligans and hopefully run their deck down in cards. That way, whenever you start your turn finally, after you get a Mewtwo, you can just use Barrier over and over again and stall them until they're out of cards. So we'll be running 1 copy of Psychic Energy in this deck. It's going to be a pretty important card for using Barrier. And I'm going to be running another copy of Psychic Energy in this deck. That way you can use Barrier. It requires 2 Psychic Energy. Going to be using a Psychic Energy in this deck as well, because when you use Barrier, you're going to have to discard one, and so you want to be able to get another one out of your deck to attach to Mewtwo, and then discard in order to use Barrier for the first time. So up next we do have a Psychic Energy, and Psychic Energy is going to be pretty important in this deck. That way you can get it out of your deck, get it attached to Mewtwo, and then ultimately discard it in order to use Barrier. Then we're going to be running a Psychic Energy. Most builds of this deck will include Psychic Energy. It's pretty much a staple for all of your Mulligan Mewtwo builds, and so that's why I'm including it here. Now this is just a framework build, you can alter it a little bit, but almost every Mulligan Mewtwo deck you're going to run into is going to run Psychic Energy, so I would really recommend keeping that card in here. Here we have a Psychic Energy, and like I just said before, this is a framework deck. You can opt to substitute in other cards, but I would just highly recommend using Psychic Energy because it does help this deck so much. It's pretty essential to getting those barriers off every turn. If you've got a keen eye, you've probably noticed that all the cards except for Mewtwo so far have been from gym sets, and in base Neo you don't really get to see gym cards used all that much. But this is a great deck for really showcasing some of those gem cards like Psychic Energy or Psychic Energy. Just a couple of examples I've used so far. Another great card for this deck is Psychic Energy. It's really going to help the deck move along and get those barrier attacks off turn after turn. So that's why I'm including it here. Here we have a base set 2 Psychic Energy, just to mix it up a little bit. A little bit later in the video I will be talking about another base set 2 card that really works in tandem with this Psychic Energy, and that will give a little oomph to Mewtwo's barrier attack. Here we have a Psychic Energy, and like I just said about Psychic Energy, this is really going to help work in tandem with a lot of these other cards, especially the gym set Psychic Energy card. When you finally get that barrier set up and you're able to use Barrier with Psychic Energy and Psychic Energy, and potentially, if you can get it on Mewtwo fast enough, a Psychic Energy, and using all of those together, you can get Barrier off. And if you're able to draw a Psychic Energy on your next turn, that means you can attach it to Mewtwo and really just use that barrier attack again, which is going to make it pretty hard for your opponent to deal any damage to you. And if they can't take any prizes or knock out all of your Pokemon, then that means that they can't win the game. Even though this build does run 2 Mewtwo, you don't want to have both of them on the field at the same time, because it's going to be a lot harder to keep energy on 2 of them, and your opponent can use Double Gust or Gust of Wind or Warp Point and swap them out, and that's going to leave one of them vulnerable. So unless there's a clear threat to Mewtwo, you want to only have one on the field, and that's the one that's in the active position. Here I have a playset of base set 2 Psychic Energy. Now a lot of builds aren't going to run a full playset. What I'm going to do in this build is I'm actually going to run another playset of Psychic Energy. Some people really think that that's a stupid idea, that you really don't need to run 8 copies of Psychic Energy, but in a full playset with Mewtwo, Mulligan Mewtwo specifically, the playsets really come into play nicely. That's why I use a third one. So at this point, it's more of a Drunk Shuckle Tri playset. And a lot of people may say that 12 is too much for a playset, but you have to reconsider that with base set 2 Psychic Energy, they're going to play off of each other very nicely. It's going to be very essential for Mulligan Mewtwo specifically. But counter to that, you see, I'm just going to play a single copy of a Neo Genesis Psychic Energy here. Now, this is going to really help play with the base set 2 Psychic Energy when you're trying to get your barrier attacks off starting on turn 2. And the same can be said for this card, which is Psychic Energy. This is going to be really important for getting on turn 3, or 4, or 5, or 6, or 7, or 8, or 9, or 10, or turn 11, or 12, or 13, or 14, or 15. A turn 15 Psychic Energy can be pretty clutch whenever you're needing to get off a barrier, maybe towards the end of the game and your opponent's running low on cards. It's really nice to draw a Psychic Energy out of your deck. That way you can attach it to Mewtwo and get that barrier off, stall for another turn, and that may be your opponent's last card in their deck to draw, especially if they've been using Bills, Professor Oaks, or if they just got a little too greedy off of their mulligans. But for that reason, that's why I run a copy of Psychic Energy. That way, when you're playing the game, you have this card as a backup. When you're using Barrier, it does require that you discard a Psychic Energy, so you kind of have to play some mental math in your head and think, what are the odds that I'm going to be able to draw a Psychic Energy next turn? That way I know for sure that I can get it on Mewtwo and use Barrier again, since I'm going to be having to discard another Psychic Energy to use Barrier. And so you run those numbers in your head and calculate a rough estimate. Well, if I have one copy of Psychic Energy in this deck, really, what are the odds of drawing it? And so that's why I also include a copy of Psychic Energy in this deck. It has a very similar effect to Psychic Energy. That way, if you can't really draw that Psychic Energy when you need it, you still have another card in your deck that you can substitute in. And, you know, that's just why I run a copy of Psychic Energy. I know a lot of people are probably going to argue down in the comments that I don't really need to use a copy of Psychic Energy in this deck, that it's stupid, but that's just the build I use. You can alter it however you want, but also include a copy of Psychic Energy, which some people would think is a risky move for Mulligan Mewtwo. But, you know, it's up to you. Also running one copy of Psychic Energy in this deck. Part of the reason I included Psychic Energy is just because it looks good in these purple dragon shields, but it can see some use in play. It's not like it's just in here for aesthetics only. It can actually be pretty useful whenever you want to use Mewtwo's barrier attack, which is kind of the core of Mulligan Mewtwo. This build is also going to run one copy of Psychic Energy, which can really throw your opponent off. If you guys have played a lot of base Neo format, you know that using Psychic Energy in tandem with base set Mewtwo to use that barrier attack can really throw your opponent off and leave them with not very many options on their turn. It's going to make them not want to draw more cards with draw power, or even maybe refresh their hand if it means they're going to be a net gain to their hand with Cleffa or something like Professor Elm, which is why I'll also include one copy of Psychic Energy in this deck. Just to throw your opponent off. It'll make it so that when you discard it to use Barrier, it's going to go in your discard pile, which your opponent can look through at any point during the game. So whenever they look at your discard and they see that a Psychic Energy is in there, they're going to assume that you may not have another copy of Psychic Energy in your deck, since most builds are just going to be running that one Psychic Energy. But what they don't know is that you do have multiple copies of Psychic Energy in this deck. As you see here, I've extended those playsets to 5 cards, so it's actually a 15 card playset of base set 2 Psychic Energy. Just kidding, I laid another one down, so it's going to be 16 cards. Just kidding again, I'm going to lay down another copy of Psychic Energy, but you'll notice this one is not base set 2 Psychic Energy. It's a little bit different. The effect and the playstyle does alter the deck just a little bit. And fooled you again, bitch, there's another Psychic Energy on the field, making for a total of 18 Psychic Energy in this playset. And if you were surprised, just imagine the surprise on your opponent's face when they realize that you're running an 18 card playset of Psychic Energy as just a standard Mulligan Mewtwo build. I think that's what's going to really set this build apart from other Mulligan Mewtwo's that you're going to see, is the way I utilize Psychic Energy in this deck and use it to play against Psychic Energy as well as Psychic Energy. That way you can really power up Mewtwo and tap its maximum potential. I really think that using Psychic Energy alongside Psychic Energy is the best way to ensure that that barrier attack is going to be usable every single turn, so that when you attach Psychic Energy to Mewtwo, you're going to be able to also use Psychic Energy to attach it to Mewtwo. That way you can use Barrier, and hopefully next turn you're able to search your deck or draw enough cards so that you can get a Psychic Energy into your hand and then attach it to Mewtwo. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, then congratulations! You have now been rewarded with 52,000 Shuckle Bucks! This video is staged to be released on April 1st, and so if you're not watching this on April Fool's Day, I'm very sorry. See you guys next video! Bye!